All right, section 1.3 is called reasoning and logic, and we're just going to get a little bit of ways into this one today, and I'm going to have you guys be working on group work from that other section we had done. We are going to get started with the reasoning and logic section. The first thing I want to present to you is what we mean by the word statement. A mathematical statement or a logic statement is simply a sentence that's true or false. So the statement, I ate cereal for breakfast, is a statement. It's either true and I did, or it's false because I didn't. Okay? But the next piece where it says non-example, what did I eat for breakfast, is not a statement. It's actually what we call a question, right? I mean, there's nothing, I can't say this is true or this is false, right? What did I eat for breakfast? It's a question. There's another thing that we use sometimes, and you'll see in your homework, that is not a statement. That is, it's a command. Okay, so if I say, eat your breakfast, that's not true or false. Now, whether you eat your breakfast or you don't eat for breakfast, that may be a good or a bad thing, but it's not a true or a false thing because it's a command telling you to do something. So we have more than just questions that aren't statements. We also have commands. Negation is the logical opposite of a statement. So if we have the notation for it, P as our statement, the negation statement uses, or the symbol uses that tilde, and you've seen it on your computer keyboards and things before. You may not have ever really used it, but it means logically opposite. So for instance, if the statement is, I ate cereal for breakfast, the negation is, I did not eat cereal for breakfast. So if I told you I ate cereal for breakfast, and then I said, no, wait, I ate eggs for breakfast. It's not the logical opposite. I mean, clearly they aren't the same thing, but it's not everything included that's not what I already told you. Okay? So you see this word not used a lot when we talk about negations. Okay, not something. Okay? If I say, I have 3 kids, the opposite of that is not, I have 4 kids. Or I have 2 kids, or I have no kids. It's, I do not have 3 kids. Okay? And negations are fairly easy to do by just putting in the word not in many situations. But there are a couple of specific situations when they're not easy to do. They're not easy to do if you have quantifiers in them. And there are 2 types of quantifiers. One are universal quantifiers. The words that are universal quantifiers are things like all, every, no, and none. Okay, there's some examples of those. Existential quantifiers are quantifiers that say something exists. So things like there exists, or some, or at least one. Those are existential quantifiers. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples using these about why they make things a little bit complicated. So here's the first one. This is a universal quantifier. The example is all people are sinners. And while it would be really nice to just put the word not in there somewhere, right, like the I did not do something, it becomes quite complicated. Not all people are sinners. Okay, but what does that mean? Does it mean nobody's a sinner? Does it mean some people are? I mean, what does that mean to put the word not in more specifically? So if we talk about the phrase all people are sinners and we want the negation to that, the negation to all people are sinners is simply that there are some people, or you could say at least one, some people are not sinners. Okay, so I don't know if it was last semester or not, but one of the semesters recently I had a class just like this one where I had all girls but one. I had one boy in the class. You guys are all female, okay? So here's the problem. If I say all of my students are female, that's great. But the phrase not all students are female would be true if I had only one guy in the room, right? That's all it would take is exactly one person here not being female to make that not work. Right? So all it takes for all people are sinners to be a false statement is one not being a sinner. All it takes is one. This is why that phrase, or that word all, you always, whatever, you've said it to your mom or dad once or something, I'm sure you have, and they say always, always. Like, well, there was that one time. All it takes is that one time for your statement to be not valid anymore, right? It doesn't work. That one time when whatever happened and all of a sudden always isn't true. That's all it takes. So to change a statement that has a universal quantifier in it, We change it, notice, to having an existential quantifier in it. It will always change in that way. So if you're creating a negation of a statement that had a universal quantifier all in it, you're going to end up having an existential quantifier in it when it changes. And some people are not sinners. Isn't the only way to do that. You could write this as at least one person is not a sinner, or there exists someone who doesn't sin. Any of those would actually be negations of this statement. Okay? All right, here's another one. This one says, this is an existential, it's got the word some in it. Some cats go to heaven. All right, so just like if I had a universal all becoming an existential some, I'm going to do the same thing. I need the word some, in other words, to turn into either all or none. That's what I need. So you tell me, I've got two options basically, and one of them's right and one of them's wrong. I can either change this into all cats go to heaven, or no cats go to heaven. Which one is it? It's no cats go to heaven. Because if I change it into all cats go to heaven, did I negate what I already had? No. In fact, I just made the statement stronger, right? So we would say, for my negation here, no cats go to heaven. So the word some turned into the word no, which is a universal quantifier. Now, depending on how the statement was worded, it might have changed into the word all, depending on what came next. That happens. It doesn't happen that some always turns into none, or something like that. That doesn't happen. Sometimes it does change into the word all. It depends on the context of what the statement was to begin with. All right, so creating these negations when you have quantifiers is more complicated. If I don't have any sums or nones or alls and I can just drop in the word not, that's easy. It's when those universal or those existential quantifiers are involved in a problem that it becomes more complicated. So we're going to do an example here. And we're going to see what happens when we create these. So I want you to try it. I gave you already an example on the previous page. So write down what you think, your best guess of what this would be when you're creating your negations, and then we'll do it together and make sure that you have the right idea. So the first one is all dogs go to heaven. And the second one is some of my classes this semester are hard. What'd you guys do for all dogs go to heaven? Okay, so the first issue is that I need to turn the word all into something like some. All would not turn into none. Why wouldn't that work? Any thoughts? You're on the right track, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but there's something else I want to hit on before that. Hang on. Why very specifically can I not just go from all to none? Because what? Say that. They're both universal quantifiers, right? Coming back over here, one of the things I said on the previous slide is if you start out universal, you need to use a quantifier that's existential the next time. Okay? So you can't go from all to none because those are both universal. So there's just a real quick and dirty, that's a rule kind of thing. But the reason why that doesn't work is exactly what you were hitting on. If I actually wrote this as no dogs go to heaven, and some of you might have done that by accident, that's okay, then what you've done is you've done above and beyond what was required. Let me go back to my example where I had the classroom where I had the one kid that was a boy in the class. Okay? If I make the statement, all of my students are girls, I don't need all of my students to be boys to make that false, right? All I need is that one student in the class that's the boy to make my statement false. So when you're creating these as negations, the idea is, what is the least possible change that I could make to make this not true? That's what a negation is. It's the least possible change that makes it false. So on this one, all I need for all dogs go to heaven for it to be false is what? Some dogs do what? Well, let's say don't go to heaven. Let's be nice. Don't go to heaven. The reality is that you and I both probably believe that dogs and cats don't go to heaven or hell, right? They don't have a soul, all that good stuff. You guys know what I'm talking about? Try not to tell it to my kids because it just makes them sad when the dog died, right? Okay, so we want to be really careful, and I'll show you why on the next one as well. We don't want to change the language in the problem as it's set up. And if we change heaven into hell, we've changed the language of the problem. The same thing on the next one where we're talking about the classes being hard. I don't want to change the word hard into easy. Why might that not be a good idea from a practical perspective on this particular problem? Yes?
Doesn't it change like the point of your sentence? Like you're talking about your classes being hard, so you switch the subject on to being easy.
That's true. It does change the point of the sentence, but you're missing something else still when you're doing that. What else?
Some of them still be hard, even if some of them are easy.
That's true. There's still something else, though, that nobody said. Do classes always have to be hard or easy?
No.
I mean, couldn't you have a class that's sort of something in between?
Yeah.
That's kind of the problem, is there's this sort of gray area. Now, we probably don't agree any of the gray area with the heaven-hell business, at least in terms of people. But in many cases, there's something in between when we just start changing things. Something doesn't have to be hard or easy. It could be somehow in between, right? And you may have classes that are like that. I definitely had classes in college that were like that, where I would say, it's not really all that hard, but maybe it's time-consuming. Okay, depending on how you define time-consuming might mean the class is hard, or it might not. So on this one then, if I have some of my classes this semester are hard, what would the negation be?
Would you negate it with the idea that only one of my classes this semester is hard?
But that's the same thing as some.
Are.
Some are hard.
Only
Well,
one.
but if I only had one, I'd still have some.
It's not. One is not some, is it?
It has the same connotation, though. If I have one, then some of them are. I hear what you're saying is that some sounds like multiple, right? It sounds like more than one. We don't use it that way. So some and at least one are interchangeable phrases. There's another reason why that doesn't work very well, Carrie Ann. Do you know why? Some and at least one are both existential quantifiers. So when I change this to negation, that word some has to turn into a universal quantifier. Okay, so let's try again. What else did you guys write down? None. Okay, so if I go with none, so if some of my classes are hard, the opposite or the negation of that is that none of my classes this semester are hard. Okay? Some of them being hard, the opposite of that is none of them are. Now, why would all of them not work?
Because you're making it.
That strengthens the statement, right? It just makes a stronger statement. Now, there is one other way to write this. It's not as pretty and it's not as helpful, but I'm going to write it down because I want you to recognize that it would work. We could say all of my classes
Or easy.
are not hard. Yeah,
Oh yeah, because our easy would be another.
exactly. All of my classes this semester, we don't want to say are easy because that's a stronger statement, right?
Yeah.
But they are not hard.
On the first one, you couldn't take away the don't, could you?
That's what I was wondering too. Like, could you
Or
just
could,
put
because
this
I
on?
put not all dogs go to.
Okay, so you put, let me write down what you did. Not all dogs.
Which is saying the same thing. It's kind of.
just the opposite of it.
Okay. So why would this phrase not be what we're looking for here? Any thoughts? Yeah. I haven't changed the quantifier. I still have a universal quantifier here.
Okay, what if you take away the don't?
Yes, I used just.
Okay, so tell me what you did. Let's take a look. So this one's no good, right? Because what you said. What else? What'd you do? You wrote some dogs go to heaven.
Because doesn't that negate the all dogs go to heaven?
Does it?
I think so, because then if it only says some dogs go to heaven, that means other dogs don't go to heaven. So that's like.
Does it necessarily?
You're changing it from qualifier to a.
Okay, so you are changing from universal to existential, so that part's good. So we got that. That's
Still
good.
saying that some dogs, that it's just weakening your statement, but not completely negating.
You're right.
Okay.
It's a weaker statement. I agree, right? It's a weaker statement that I had before. Instead of saying all of them do, you're just saying some of them do. The problem is that saying some of them do is you're not saying what happens to the other ones. So our concern when we do a negation is making the statement the opposite of what we did. And the statement you're creating is simply a weaker statement of what you had before. So instead of worrying about the ones that still do, we're concerned with the one that doesn't. For instance, if I tell you that some of my students are girls, that really doesn't tell you that I have any boys. It really doesn't tell you anything about the other students. I may or may not have boys if I just tell you some of my students are girls. Now, the way that we use English, we're interpreting that to say that some of them are also boys. But our concern when we're creating these is to create an opposite statement, not just a weaker statement than what I had before. Okay? So we don't need this statement because it didn't negate what I had.
But what about on the second one, whenever you did, like, the none of my classes this semester are hard? Doesn't it do the same thing, because then you don't know what those classes are? Like, you know they're not hard, but you don't know what kind of classes they are.
You're right, except that the only thing that we're trying to talk about in this class is the hard part. You're
Isn't it
basically...
the same for the A, like, the only part you want to talk about is the heaven part?
Right, so
You
we're
know what I'm
wanting to
saying?
say the opposite of going to heaven is not going to heaven.
Same with, like, the classes being hard, not being hard. Wouldn't
Mhm.
they be, like, the same situation, just different? Like, you're ignoring what the classes are if they're not hard, and you're ignoring where the dogs go if they don't go to heaven?
The problem is where you're starting and where you're ending up. So on the second one, we're starting with an existential and we're turning it into a universal. Okay? On the first one, we started with a universal and we're turning it into an existential. So, for instance, if you'd started with some dogs go to heaven or some dogs don't go to heaven, that statement right there, then going into a universal statement would have a different feel to it. I think that's why you're feeling like they look a little different, is because we're moving from universal into existential instead of the other way around.
Okay, I got it.
Okay. Do you guys get a feel for why these are a little tricky? They are. They're a little tricky. Okay, so you have to be a little bit careful, and the semantics and how we use English makes it a little bit tricky. All right?